interesting discussion. What I'd like to do before we introduce our guests is just give you a few words about Edenbridge Partners. For those of you who don't know, we are a search, interim and consulting firm, and we've been operating now for 15 years, helping businesses with complex change, senior hires, and making great companies. The consulting practice is part of our complements our brilliant search and interim practices. And we specialize as a consulting practice in structure, culture, and processes. We believe culture is really important for making companies work effectively, because in the simplest form, companies are just the organizational structures and the processes, but it's the people that make it work. It's the people that bring it together and make companies effective or not. Before I hand over to our guests, I'm just going to give you a few personal thoughts and reflections about culture. It's an area I've worked in for my entire career, and I'm going to be really honest with you, I still don't fully understand it. I've learned a lot, I've got a lot more to learn. What I find is if you ask 100 people what culture is, you'll get 100 different answers. It's kind of the glue that holds us all together, and it's the thing that makes us work effectively without returning to first principles. Cultures can be great and make work really happy and enjoyable, or perhaps not, depending on where you work. And what I would like to do today is just think about this from different perspectives, and that's why I've invited our panelists to share their thoughts, their personal views, their personal experiences. So there isn't one right answer here. In fact, we might not always agree. That's what I'm going to make today really interesting and enjoyable for us all. So what I'd like to do is just hand over to our guests. The first person I'd like to introduce is Kate Guthrie.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks very much for that, Justin. That was a great introduction. So good morning, everyone. My name is Kate Guthrie. I am currently a non-executive director and senior independent director. I work with 4 different organisations now, including the Scottish Ballet, a major government department, a financial services software business, which is PE funded, and also an asset manager. In terms of executive career, I'm a career chief people officer, worked in multiple sectors for many different organisations, and I'm hoping that I can bring a broad set of perspectives to what is an incredibly interesting subject matter this morning. And thank you to the audience for the great questions that we've received in advance. Thanks, Justin.
Thank you, Kate. Second guest I'd like to introduce is John Maltby.
Justin, thank you very much, and great to be here with everybody. So I'm John Maltby. I'm well into my 3rd phase of my career as a non-executive director. I have been chair of renewable energy companies, healthcare companies, and also not-for-profit. But I now have 3 companies in my portfolio. I'm sitting in the offices of Alica Bank, who are a fintech bank serving SMEs, with a fastest growing company in the UK last year, the 2nd fastest growing company in Europe. I also on the board of a Westbourne Building Society. I chair that organisation, 175-year-old organisation owned by its members, and I'm on the board of Nordea, which is the 10th largest bank in Europe. So very different cultures. And like Kate, I had an executive career. I actually started my career in consultancy, but then I decided I needed a proper job. Apologies, Justin. And probably a few people on the call, but and you could argue whether I did get a proper job, because I worked for 25 years in banking and as an executive, including I led the commercial bank at Lloyd's, and I also led a smaller specialist bank onto the FTSE 250. So that's me. I'm looking forward to the conversation. I share your thoughts about cultures. You are constantly learning, so I'm hoping to learn from this as well.
Fantastic. Thank you, John. And finally, I'd like to introduce Asha Rikhazen.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, John, Kate, Justin. Very good to see you. My name is Asha Rikhazen. I'm the founder of Seymour Consulting, and we work in the field of strategy, culture, and leadership, trying to help organizations align those 3 powerful forces. The current clients range enormously from the United Nations, who are currently undergoing some pretty difficult things culturally, to Gymshark, a small, very entrepreneurial, huge, fast-growing business run by the founder, who's still in his early 30s. So big differences in culture. And because we work internationally, we see culture in the same organization from many different perspectives, which is also a kind of very interesting facet of the work. Before that, I was responsible for strategy and change at T-Mobile, which is now E2E, EE rather. And I noticed then the impact that the leadership team could have on culture, how we influence things, sometimes deliberately, sometimes accidentally, sometimes for the good, sometimes for the bad. But this area of culture is completely fascinating. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
It's fantastic. Thank you, Asher. So my first question, and the way we're going to do this is ask the occasional question, but really it's about the conversation and let that flow. But my first question is for you, Kate. We talked about culture. What does it mean to you?
Thanks, Justin. So I think we've sort of already covered slightly in the introduction that, you know, culture is something that can be defined in many ways. For me personally, Justin, and in the context of organisations, which is what we're talking about here today, culture to me means or relates to the sort of values, beliefs, behaviours, the way the organisation operates, the way that people work together. And, you know, it can be conscious or it can be unconscious. Why I think it's important is that, you know, conscious attention to culture can be a massive enabler of delivering your strategy for the business, and then for the people in an organisation. I think, you know, a strong positive culture can be something that enables people to self-actualize and be at their very best, and hopefully, you know, that you get that link through to strong performance and strategic delivery.
That's fantastic. So I'll just share the thoughts, John or Asher, whoever would like to go next.
I'll jump in, John, if that's all right with you. I agree with what Kate has said entirely, and I really like this focus on what's conscious and what's unconscious, and both of which have an influence. So what you pay attention to really matters, and the more conscious you are about what's going on, the more you can pay attention to the things you want to. Just a couple of metaphors that I think are helpful that draw attention to different aspects of culture. One is to think of it as a climate. So a climate covers a broad range of possibilities, but you'd expect to see sort of repeating patterns within that. But you might have particular weather events. Another way to think of it is a shadow. And I like that one because it's there, but you can't grasp hold of it. It's changing, it's moving. It's very difficult to get it exactly the shape you would like it to be. And another one that I like, because it draws attention to the fact that although we tend to think of culture outside ourselves, it's also very much in us, which is our internal set of rules and beliefs about what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. And it distinguishes members of one group from another. So I think, you know, it's very much about helping you to believe that you belong, who's inside and who's outside, for the good and the bad that brings.
Maybe, Justin, I'll pick up on one of the points that Asher made, which I do agree with. And I think organizations have a culture whether they like it or not. The interesting thing, and just picking up on Asher's point, is that organizations are living organisms, you know, and the culture within the organization, you know, is factored by a range of external and internal characteristics, but it's also related to maybe some aspects about, you know, if you have a command and control type organization, well, maybe the culture is more common than it should be, but actually not for good reasons. Whereas if you have a more organic organization, then actually the interplay between the cultures of teams, of cultures in different regions, cultures in, you know, in how they interact with each other is really fascinating. And I think for me, culture does evolve, you know, culture does live, and you do need to spend the time understanding it, listening to it, reacting to it, responding to it. And I think, as Asher's described it, you know, it can be quite personal, and I do like the point about, you know, it's sort of how I feel. It's a lot about how I feel and whether I feel I belong. and whether that is and whether I feel that I belong and my colleagues do as well. So I think there's a lot of interactions here, which is why I think, Justin, in your introduction, you described that you're constantly learning, because I think we all are. And it is contextual. I think that's the other point. It is very contextual.
I think context is everything. Context very much drives what we believe and therefore how we behave and what the culture is that we get. We don't come to culture as blank sheets, do we? We come to culture with our own particular experience. We might come with our national characteristics. We might come in with assumptions, based on our upbringing. And within an organization, perhaps, if you're a member of the running club, or if you're a smoker who goes outside to join the other smokers, whatever, all those are sort of micro cultures within the main culture. So broadly, there's something consistent, but there's a lot of difference. So that point that both Kate and John made about actually paying attention to what's going on in reality, I think is really, really important.
I agree. I'll share from my own views is that culture on one level, it is the collective ways of working, if you look at it in a company. But I agree with what you said, it's much deeper than that. I don't believe there is one culture. I believe it is organic. I think we all bring something to the party, but it gives a language almost of the way we can work together, the way we can cooperate together. And that makes companies very successful. Now, we'll come on to later about, the command and control type companies. And yes, they have a particular culture, but whether that brings the best out of employees, we can have a discussion about that as we progress. But I think it's a really interesting concept. And that's why, when we open this conversation, there isn't one answer here. We've got four of us, all with views, all very similar views, but we've got slightly different nuances. And that makes it really, really cool, actually.
Yeah, I think the one thing you simply cannot afford to do is as John said, whatever happens, there is culture. So you can't afford to pretend in some way it's not either helping, hindering, or doing something to the outcome from the organization. It is there.
I agree, Asha, and I think attention to it and strong focus on it is such an opportunity for businesses. And building your capability as an organisation around your own culture can really drive advantage. I remember once in one of the organisations I worked for, culture was often described as what happens when nobody is looking, which was a definition that personally I hated because I felt it was quite a negative, sort of thought around how culture develops and evolves, because I think you can be deliberate, planful, thoughtful, and you can drive real advantage from it.
And I think that one of the aspects we've talked about, culture is there whether you like it or not, and I like that sort of phrase. I don't think one of the questions I know that we were going to debate is what is great culture, and I think it depends. I mean, I think you can't sort of, because for some organizations, given the context that they're facing, maybe they're in a really they've got a real deep issue that they need to address. I've been in organizations where it's been in turnaround, for example. Now, you absolutely need to be crystal clear about what's expected, and you've got to make decisions really quickly. And there is more of an element of command and control in that type of organization, rather than one which I've been involved with now, which is much more innovative, startup, and really want to embrace that. So I think that one of the aspects about culture is that you need to look upon your business vision, your purpose of your organization, and then see where the culture that you listen to, where people describe what it's like to be here, whether they belong, how they belong, whether that's consistent with the purpose of the organization, whether that's consistent with the direction that you're going, or where there are differences. And I think, to me, there are some common characteristics of great culture, in my view, and in great cultures, the vast majority of people feel that they belong. I think that's a common feature, because otherwise, why they're there? They want to be there. They feel that they're making. The vast majority of people understand what the organization is trying to achieve and why they are part of that, and how they're part of that. To me, that is a positive about a culture. But great cultures, to me, are responsive to the context and situation as well, because they evolve. If something, the world has gone a bit bonkers, frankly, as we know. And Kate, I think in some of your roles, you'll know probably closer than many of us. But I think, therefore, the cultures and the point that was made, I think Asher made the point that people's personal lives and what they hear and see affect how they operate in the work environment. So therefore you need to understand that, and you need to evolve and listen to that. But I do think cultures are somewhat dependent upon the life stage of the organization, the external context, the challenges in terms of what they're facing. And in many ways where they are and the external factors that they're subject to. But fundamentally, my view is that it is important to listen to the culture, to understand the culture, and to then think through how that can affect the objectives of the organization and vice versa.
It's interesting what you say, John, because I completely agree with you. And in my experience, I've worked in, as a consultant, I've seen a lot of companies and I've seen a lot of cultures in different countries, never mind different organizations and sectors. And if I was to say, what are the two things that make a culture great? It is that it fits with the strategy of what that company is trying to do. The culture is right to achieve our goals. And secondly, and you made the point yourself, John, it is getting everyone behind it in a way that they feel empowered and comfortable to get behind it, so that they want to deliver for themselves and they want to deliver for the company. Those things aren't competing, they're complementing each other.
Sure. I've seen an interesting question on the chat, and I just think this is a perfect one for you, Asher. Be interested to hear views on how you have successfully managed the cultural differences within global organizations. And what I thought of when I read that was the United Nations. I just thought, wow.
Well, luckily, I'm not responsible for culture in the United Nations. I don't know if anyone is. I think it is really important to honor where people are coming from and what they believe in. So I think it is not sufficient just to try and through sheer weight of sort of argument or pressure, try and get people to change their fundamental beliefs. I think you have to understand what the fundamental beliefs are and to see how they fit within the culture you're trying to create, the values that you have of the organization. Slightly sidestepping your question, John, but picking up on your point of belonging. Zappos, they're a US online shoe selling company, got extremely big, extremely quickly, got bought by Amazon, and had absolutely legendary customer service, and their whole brand, their whole strategy, everything was based around customer service. And they would offer their customer service staff a good sum of money within the first 2 weeks to leave the organization. They would say, if you don't feel you belong here, please take this money and go. So they were really, really clear about, if you don't feel you fit, leave now, which I think both honored the beliefs of that individual, but also what the company was trying to produce, but made it very, very overt. And I thought that was such an interesting experiment.
I think there is another way to look at it with global organizations, and having worked for a couple of them, where you've got people who speak different languages, who live in different continents, who have different sort of societal, religious, ethical values, etc. I think, as a big organization, I still think there's an advantage and something really important about thinking through what does bind a global organization in terms of values and behaviors and, organizational norms and what's expected of people. And where I've seen that done best are those organizations that keep their strategy as, I'll use the word simple, but I don't mean simple. What I mean is a strategy that is expressed as simply as possible so that you can gain maximum understanding, and is then underpinned and communicated, with a set of values and behaviors that, again, expressed simply, can help people across different cultures bind themselves to that organization. Not an easy task, but it can be done, and I have seen it done really well. And that has led to a sort of high performing global business. So I think, again, John, I think you used the word, it's so driven by context, isn't it? What's appropriate, what works in different situations, in different contexts. I think that is, as an exec and as a leader, I think, you apply yourself, first of all, to what sector am I in? What is it the purpose of the organisation is trying to achieve? What are the challenges that we're facing into? And then, how do you think about your culture in that context?
And just really some personal experience on this, and that I joined Nordea, which is a large Nordic bank, partly because of their social purpose, and everybody on the board joined for that reason. But it's a very international board, and one of the things that I learned very quickly, and actually there were some questions about hybrid working and so on, that really reinforced it, is that even when you're speaking to different people, and it happens to be every variety of Nordics, so Finnish people, Norwegian people, Swedish people, Danish people, as well as Italian, Australian, various other things. The way in which language is interpreted in an international organization is quite different. So Swedes, a huge generalization, but are quite conservative. And so if they say something I'm not quite sure about, that they really mean over my dead body. Yeah. And I've learned that. And the interesting thing is that, and when you speak to the groups and speak to people about how open, Norwegian people are much more open and maybe very expressive, and that's just a microcosm. That challenge is amplified 100 times when you're trying to run a board meeting or in a virtual environment, because you pick up, and we're really good as skilled as humans at picking up verbal. Because I can see, I see Kate nodding, which is great. I can't see the 500 other people who are probably asleep. But the point being is that those differences are amplified if you haven't got the whole experience of spending time with people, but time physically with people. So I'm a great fan of hybrid working, but I'm also recognize that it does create particular challenges within this cultural area. We've talked about culture being a whole mishmash of things, and I think the international and the global, which at one level is fantastic because you don't have to travel everywhere to have those conversations, but it does make it sometimes quite difficult because the communication tips and techniques and things we've learned over many years are different in different cultures.
Absolutely. I'm just going to pause there for a moment because, to John's point, I just want to make sure the audience is awake. So I'm going to ask for them to participate in a poll for a second. And we just got one question. The question is, do you believe your organisational culture is great or not? So it's a yes or no answer. Quick insight. Excellent. Oh, here we go. The results are coming in right now. And this is very interesting, isn't it? Wow. So perhaps a result I didn't expect. We've got 58% saying that they don't believe they have a great culture, and 42% saying that they do have a great culture. So I'm going to return to the panel. Get your thoughts on that, please.
Justin, if I can, the poll has actually reinforced something that I was thinking about as John was speaking earlier. There's something in the chat from Dave Roberts, thank you, Dave, who's talked about where there was tensions across different cultures in organisations, and the word alignment is used. And actually, that's one of the things that I think is so important when you set out on work around culture in an organisation. Is where it falls into disrepute and is discredited is where the expressed culture and the desired culture do not align with people's own experiences of the organisation. And a lot of that, I think, starts at the top of the organisation in terms of, is there board and exec alignment? To John's point about sitting around a board table with colleagues from different cultures and making sure that you really understand what's going on. And, that translates at every level of the organisation. So I think, that when we talked earlier about being conscious or unconscious about your culture, alignment, context is important. Alignment is everything in terms of credibility. and then, you know, do the mechanisms and frameworks that support your cultural ambitions do the job they're supposed to do.
On that point about alignment, Kate, I think alignment is everything. Well, alignment and context, but you create alignment within the context. But I think one of the interesting things I observe about alignment is you can only create alignment if you're willing to explore difference. So you get a version of creating alignment, which is we create alignment, which is I would describe as pseudo alignment, and all we've done is not discovered difference.
Yeah.
If you're brave enough, and sometimes you do need courage to uncover difference, then you often create much more alignment, even if you don't iron out the difference, because the difference is there, whatever. But in the second situation, you know the difference is there and it's easier to work with. But even in order to have that conversation, that depends on the culture of the organization or the culture of the country, you know, whatever, because some organizations find it very difficult to confront difference in a positive way.
It's interesting you say that, Asher, because if you did that the other way around, let's say culture was homogenous, everybody's the same, everybody's doing the same thing, it's just not going to work, is it? You know, to John's earlier point, culture is organic. Part of being organic is being responsive to the environment, seeing the opportunities, being able to adapt and respond. And that means you need people with different views and perspectives and ways of seeing the world to make a company work effectively. And I think it'd be a very sad thing if we went through culture change programs, as they're often called, and tried to sheep dip people and make them all the same. It would take the energy, it would take the fun, and it would take the effectiveness out of work.
Gwyneth is, oh, sorry, John, you go.
Yeah, I was just reflecting on this, you know, on both the poll, you know, the 56% think that they have a bad culture, and some of the comments in the chat about some of the changes that have happened, you know, through COVID and hybrid and so on. And also the comments about it's hard. It is hard. And I think to your point, Asher, you do need to explore the differences. You need to spend the time, really spend the time listening. There was another comment about, you know, that culture is not top down, and that's why those sheep dip comments, sheep dip processes, you know, don't work and actually are resented and probably are counterproductive in my view. Yeah, it really, I think, exploring what the issues are, what the differences are, what the ambitions are, what the purposes are, and having the conversations around that, and having open conversations around how do we understand those differences? How do we, if there are people aren't feeling their belonging, how do we address them? And not imposing that. That's why I see some of the American firms that I mean, I'm probably being a disservice to American firms, but the organizations that say we insist on 5 days a week in the office, that feels very command and control. And you know, in the organization I'm sitting in now, actually we haven't got enough space in the office because people want to come into the office. We have a very open, people have the choice about whether they come in or not, but actually the team here, you know, non-executive shouldn't take any credit for it, but I certainly don't, but the team here from bottom up have started to describe how can they have the interactions such that people value the time that they come into the office and want to do that and actually share and learn from that, not just about innovation, not just about, you know, the needing to connect with people, but actually also about learning and so on. So I think it is about it's about listening, it's about being patient. It's about not thinking that there is a silver bullet by saying, you know, if we get everybody in the office at the same time, then everything's all solved. It creates more issues. And I think the world is getting more and more complex, you know, geopolitically, social media, norms, expectations of people as in different generations and intergenerational work. There's a whole raft of complexity that's out there. And which is why you need to constantly spend your time looking at this, understanding this, learning this, and never think you've got a great culture. And that's probably the point, because it will evolve and do that. So I'm interested in terms of, we ask the question, good or great or bad, or good or bad. I think it's a continuum, if I'm honest. And organizations probably move up and down that continuum depending upon the issues they're resolving and some elements that they've got right.
Absolutely. And we're just touching on something there, John, and I'm going to ask this question, and I'm going to Asher if I may. Do you believe you can actually change a culture?
I have a belief cultures are changing all the time. So I think there's often a broad picture of a culture, but within that, there are so many differences and so much evolution that if you really listen, as John says, and really pay attention, as Kate says, you will notice there is a lot of change going on. We had the massive experiment, didn't we, in 2020 of COVID, where suddenly organizational cultures shifted almost immediately. And the really interesting thing about that to me was much of the shift was not driven by people being told what to do. It was by people deciding how best to respond to the situation. So the change in context was really clear. And then people had often quite a lot of choice, not always, but often quite a lot of choice about how they responded. Now, often to the outside, organizations managed to continue to deliver the service they had been delivering. But that was only because lots and lots and lots of people made all sorts of tiny adjustments or large adjustments that weren't visible. So cultures can shift. The question then is, do they stay changed or do they revert? Because I always imagine there's a very strong piece of elastic pulling us back to the way we were, to the status quo. And every time you move further away, you get pulled back. So what gets amplified and what gets dampened down after there's been change depends then on what happens next. One tiny example of culture change that I was really excited by was an organization that they were very hierarchical, traditional financial services being challenged by fintech, and they needed to make themselves much more agile. They needed to break out of the hierarchy. They needed much more collaboration. And when they were announcing what they needed to do as an organization strategically and culturally, they were having their annual conference. And instead of inviting the most senior people in the organization to the conference, they said, we've got 300 seats. Anyone who's really interested in changing this organization can come along. And the message and the medium were absolutely aligned with each other. And of course, that act in itself disturbed the hierarchy, and all sorts of other things happened. And they did completely change their culture over the next few years. But I think for something to change, it needs to be countercultural. And if it's countercultural, it feels disturbing, creates anxiety. Most of us don't like acting counterculturally.
Very interesting, Asher. Oh, sorry.
I was just going to use maybe an example, because I think that the example that you gave is that sometimes changing culture is somewhat opportunistic. There are certain situations or certain things that the organization or the broader society needs to respond to. And we've all been in organizations where big changes happened externally, or there's, and actually it's how the organizations react to that. I mean, I'll just use one example, because it was bottom up, and this was an example that several of us on the call were involved with. The London Olympics organization I work for, and many of us work for, were sponsors of that. And originally it was the choice was there, frankly, to entertain the great and the good and get business out of it. And then it became a problem because we had the financial crisis and banks were no longer popular, and this was the wrong thing to do. What came from below was an idea that said, actually, let's use our sponsorship to create jobs for some of our customers. And so what happened was that the organization the people in the organization ran 750 workshops around the country, training our customers to how you bid for the Olympics contracts. And the organization, or the market share of the organization, was about 20%. And I think about 35% of the contracts were awarded to the customers of that. And that was something where everybody in the organization got behind it. We were bringing as a bank to the customers something which helped them run their business, and it was bottom up, and it suddenly was something. It was, to me, that was opportunistic. Happened to be that somebody had made a decision to waste money on sponsorship. There was a need to do something better with it, and actually it created. And it was also at the time when banks weren't seen as supporting customers. But to me, that created a real sense of purpose opportunistically, and it did create, I think, a movement for a period of time. I'm not sure whether the elastic, I think you're right about the elastic, by the way, Asher, because I don't think that organization and many of the large banks have remembered that well. But to me, that was a good example about not the leaders, but the organization responding to an opportunity and making a difference.
So Justin, if I might build on the elastic band thing, because I think Ash is right. I think the risk with trying to change cultures is understanding how to achieve sustained change over a long period. There is a comment in the chat about, culture can largely be a feature of the CEO, which is, for me, that's absolutely right, and I've seen it. But actually, that's not what really helps an organisation. The culture of the organisation should be about the institution as a whole and what helps it to be successful. And I think, to get beyond that elastic band piece, you've got to think about what is going to incentivise the kind of behaviour and values you want to see being demonstrated that link back to driving performance and business success. And, as a practicing sort of CPO, I always thought about, what's the purpose of the organisation? What's the strategy? What are the challenges that we face into? And, how does that drive our mission and goals around people? But then beyond that, how do you then ensure that you drive the right behaviours by putting the right people management frameworks, reward mechanisms? Do you hire to the values? Do you train to them? Do you retain to them? Do you reward people? How do you develop the language of the organisation around those values? So I think there are some quite big structural things that you can do that hopefully would have a life over a long period, that become part of the sort of living and breathing of the organisation and landing, the culture that you really want to drive.
That's really interesting, Kate, and I completely agree with everything all three of you just said. I'll just add in some of my own thoughts on that. For me, there is no such thing as cultural revolution, but it can evolve and you can nudge it in the right direction. But nudging it is doing all the things you just described there, Kate. It is about leadership, it is about reward, it is about a whole list of other things. But in my own experience, what doesn't work is the command and control telling people, you will change your behavior because I say so. What does work is creating an environment where employees feel empowered, that they want to help the culture evolve. They believe that the actions they take, the things they do are good for them and good for the company. And then they'll make their own behavioral adjustments. And it goes back to a point made earlier, and apologies, can't remember who made it, that this is an incremental thing. If you want a culture to be really, really effective, you've got to empower everybody to come to their own answers, to create that environment where they can work it out themselves within the context and within the framework.
I agree. Oh, sorry, John, go ahead.
I think that, to me, I was just really thoughtful about that. I just wonder whether there are circumstances. I wouldn't want to work in an organisation that had a command and control culture, but I'm just wondering whether there are extreme situations, war zone, whatever. I don't know, but it's an interesting point, which is about this context where actually it is really important that people follow instructions and directions. I say it's not something I would personally be suited for. I wouldn't be attracted to it at all. But I just wonder whether it is the right assumption that our beliefs and our views, and in many ways you self-select. And I'm a great believer that organizations and people are self-selecting, is that people go to an organization because they believe they can add value, they want to work there, they feel belonging and so on. So there's an element of self-selection there. And I would not self-select an organization that was command and control. But just an interesting point about whether there is ever that is the right answer. And I don't know.
I think, so obviously I work for a major government department where command and control can be absolutely mission critical in certain circumstances. Equally, that presents other challenges for the organisation when, you're in normal operating environment and you're not in a crisis. And I think, again, a lot of the sort of support I give in that environment is around helping people to be conscious of the dilemmas and complexity they face into when having to live in a world where you might have to hold two different cultures in your hands or brain at the same time. So in a way, that's what makes it interesting and fascinating. I think, you referred earlier, Asha, to the COVID period, which, I was the CPO of a bank at the time. And actually, it was myself and the chief operating officer who basically took over the sort of, I don't mean day-to-day running in its entirety, but who drove the operationalization of the company into a remote model very quickly. And actually, what we did, which I thought was interesting, wasn't so much command and control, but we swept aside a lot of the things that, are thought to be there for good reason in normal operating environment, but actually were getting in the way of rapid decision making, mobilization, operation, enablement. So it was quite a fascinating period, really, because we stuck to our norms of, respectful, inclusive, involving behaviors, but actually we were driving harder and faster than we normally would because we had to. So I think COVID presented a very interesting time for us to look at organizational behavior and how you do have to pivot to more command and control whilst, doing it in a way that supports your existing company values. So I think it's a very interesting subject matter and quite a tough one. I do think when you're in a major crisis, I think organizations do revert to it. I think how you execute command and control becomes then it's a huge part of how people experience it.
Can I give you an example that relates to that? Do you remember Hurricane Katrina in the United States that obliterated New Orleans? So massive hurricane. It was forecast to come, it arrived. 3 different organizations responding to it. The government organizations basically couldn't help. They'd had the warning, they'd had a drill a year before, they didn't learn, they couldn't help. Basically because their bureaucracy prevented it. And people were so scared of making a mistake, they wouldn't make anything. So they couldn't get international aid in or anything. Walmart, the CEO said to the Walmart stores in the area, you have my backing, whatever you need to do, do it. It's your decision, you're close to it. And they did things like giving people medical prescriptions for free, banking checks. One of the store managers there took a bulldozer through their ruined store, pushed everything out that was of use into the car park and said to the local community, if you want it, you can have it, come and get it. So that was about giving away power. And the US Coast Guard, extremely effective because their company values were all about, we're putting the decision-making as close to the front line as it possibly can. So they were much more adept at local people on the ground making the decisions. And I thought those 3 examples in crisis illustrated, what differences in culture do. To be a little bit provocative, Kate, I wondered during COVID, when there was no choice, many organizations decided we now have to trust people. And one of the things that, control, I think, largely reduced and trust increased, and that allowed so much more to get done. However, I think some of that elastic has begun to pull back.
I would agree. I mean, when I was talking about getting stuff done in COVID, I was much more about, if you think about Microsoft Teams, for example, most companies had a sort of 3-year plan to roll it out and rolled it out in like 4 weeks because the imperative was so great. Yes. So that's where I think we swept aside some of the normal constraints. And it was a very good example of what can be done when you do empower and you do give people a mandate and trust them to get on and do it, frankly.
Yeah. Just going to pause there for a moment because there's a couple of themes coming through on the web chat I'd like us to explore. So one of those is about the leader. And there's different opinions, different comments here. And one of the things I find very interesting and completely agree with is that if the leader isn't living the values, why should everybody else?
Yes.
That's one subject. And I think let's get some thoughts on that. And secondly, there's some comments about merger and acquisitions. You're bringing 2 completely different cultures together. The imperative there, how far do you bring them together? How far do you let them do their own thing? And actually something that has always struck me is that lots of companies spend a lot of money making an acquisition, but very rarely do they do any sort of understanding of the culture before they acquire the place and don't consider if it's going to fit. So I'd like to, any of you would like to comment on that, those 2 subjects, please?
Maybe if I start on the merger and acquisitions, I think you're right. People don't spend anytime on the culture. But for me, the way that you should look upon this is that when you're looking at a merger or an acquisition, you're looking about the capabilities, the combination of the capabilities, and what's the purpose of the acquisition? Is the purpose of the acquisition that you're actually there to take costs away and synergies through that, or actually is there that maybe an organization is a product organization and you're merging with a distribution organization, so suddenly you're creating a great opportunity in terms of growth? To me, that context is really important to think about the benefits or otherwise of cultures, because in the second example, where it is about actually it's collaboration and it's about really recognizing and understanding the values of both organizations and how they can be complementary and how there's a win-win situation. Unfortunately, sometimes in mergers and acquisitions, it's about taking costs out, and in that situation, I do think that, back to the first point, being really clear about the leaders' values and being really authentic about what the objectives and how that is going to be achieved, and living that is going to be really important. But unfortunately, it may well be there's some really difficult decisions and some consequences that mean that it is more of a takeover and an imposition to achieve that objective, rather than and there are, it's like Kate's point, there are consequences with that. There are consequences of actually doing a takeover and basically stripping out costs, that what you're left with is a bruised organization, an organization that's going to take some time to repair. But so I think it is, again, contextual, and I do think that people spend a lot of time thinking about what is the objectives of this merger, what's the combination of the capabilities, what we are trying to achieve. The next question they should ask, or as an iterative question, they should say, how does that affect the culture that we understand? How is that going to impact the culture we're going forward? And how do we sort of signal that and be clear about that and live it? So to me, it's contextual, but there are quite different approaches you might take, but it does require understanding.
I agree with you, John. One thing that's going through my mind here with M&A or restructuring activity, there's an underlying fear, right? Even if you are confident you're making change to a company and it's all positive, people will fear change in itself. So a big part of helping a culture is helping people build their confidence. And if they build their confidence, then they can feel more empowered. And if they feel more empowered, they can help create the great culture that you want.
Not necessarily very helpful thing to say, but just an observation that I notice sometimes going into an organization that might have had a merger 5 years in the past, the half-life of the cultures that existed before that and the brands that existed before that were extremely long. The point of being able to see the material still on the walls, the mugs still being drunk from, people still very much associated with their bit and thinking about the others coming from your bit, and it really, I think, again, this thing we were talking about earlier, I think you have to honor what's there before you can try and merge it, change it, or do anything to it. So unless you've done that, I think you're going to have extreme difficulty in trying to get anyone to move on.
I agree entirely with you, Asha, and have seen that in practice myself. When I joined a major UK bank who had merged with another bank, maybe 5 or 6 years before I joined, people still talked about whether they were green or blue. And I think that's a lag on performance and integration, actually, when you have people that are, they're thinking, that's what they're thinking about. They're not thinking about the thing that they're part of now. I have seen it done really well in a couple of different contexts. In an FMCG business, a big global merger where the board were very attentive to and conscious of the opportunity to create and to start the creation of a new culture for day one of the organization, and had done a lot of work and put a lot of stuff in place to sort of inspire colleagues as to the future of this new organization, its mission, its purpose, its values, how colleagues would be performance managed via those values. There's a lot of work done before day one that I think gave that company a flying start, actually, that led to a very long period of superior performance. And in another organization, I've seen it done much more bottom up, where, to your point about honouring the past, I completely agree with you. You know, when you bring two companies together, dissing one or the other is probably the worst thing you can possibly do, because people have been part of that institution and given themselves to it, and they're proud, and rightly so. So I think taking care of that, honouring the past, creating the culture of the future, building on the best of both businesses wherever you can, and, you know, taking it forward in a very conscious way is such a big opportunity. And, you know, if it's not done well, you get a lag on creating the, you know, the performance and the culture for the future.
Yeah, I think one of my biggest learnings with culture is not respecting the past, and I've made that mistake. You know, absolutely I have, and I've learned that error. And what you can do with it is turn it into an advantage, because if you are respectful for the past, what you're also saying to people is, you know what, you've all changed lots and lots of times before, and what we're going through now is another change. And the realization that we're just going through another change takes away the fear, the barrier of that, and enables people and empowers people to make the changes.
This is taking it a slightly different direction. However, when we talk about leaders and the influence of leaders, of course, it's massive, possibly more in terms of them undoing the culture they want rather than standing for the culture they want. But I also think AI is going to become increasingly important in that, because effectively AI will become extremely influential, and is extremely influential in many organizations, and effectively will increasingly hold the beliefs, the values, the assumptions of the organization within it. And therefore, unless there's real attention being given to how that is being developed, how it's being used, the rules that are placed around it, if there are any, all of that will have an absolutely massive impact on organizational cultures. And I suspect we're late on it in understanding it.
Mm-hmm. I think that AI absolutely is going to be a major influence. There are probably others that are happening. The whole social media, but also maybe the whole fake news sort of, you know, what do people, you know, culture beliefs are based upon certain things that you sort of, I suppose, have learned to respect, including the point about, you know, valuing the past. If in wider society some of those are dismantled or questioned, I think that's quite challenging for individuals, for society, and for the organizations, because, you know, unfortunately, at some, you know, the communication, the opportunity to communicate requires upon building that trust and authenticity and so on. And if that's being undermined, you know, you have to find different ways of delivering that and showing that and believing that. And I think that, I mean, AI is a great example, but I think there are probably other factors. That the world is changing so quickly, and these have an impact on how people feel, their belief system, where their ambitions, their points of security. There was a question in the chat about, you know, people feeling, you know, those are threatened. And this is what, back to the point about the leaders, you can't ignore that. You know, you need to find a way of understanding that, harnessing that, helping people through those situations. But it's getting tougher. It's getting more complex and much tougher.
I agree, John. And I think one of the things we haven't touched on today actually is, you know, we are in a 24/7 world now. You know, things get challenged in ways that are, you know, quite unique and different, certainly someone of my generation. And I think keeping your organization stable in a world where we do have fake news, we have all, you know, all that sort of stuff going on, I think one of the capabilities that's critical to supporting an organization's culture is really good, strong internal communications. And, you know, the ability of an organization to help colleagues understand their context, their strategy, their mission, their purpose, their values. I think that's a skill set now that is growing in importance, actually, and being able to make sure that you can respond to a 24/7 world and keep your messaging consistent, make sure colleagues are on board, that they know, you know, where, I can't bear these words, but, you know, sort of where the truth lies and stuff like that. I think, you know, culture, communications as an enabler of culture is a really critical skill set, and it is only going to grow.
Here, Kate.
I'm just very conscious we're nearly at the end of our time today, so I'd just like to go to each of you in turn and just one comment, and then I'd like to bring the session to a close and just a few final words from myself. So Asha, I'm going to go to you first, if I may.
It's been deeply enjoyable. It's everything a conversation about culture should be. I wish I were here for 2 days.
Kate, can I get your thoughts, please?
I can only second that. I think the other thing that I'd want to add, and it is pointed to in the chat, is that, you know, and I would say this, wouldn't I, as a previous CPO, culture is about the whole organisation, shouldn't be owned by HR. It's a business imperative, and, you know, important that, you know, board and senior leadership all engaged.
And John?
I would say that we're all continuously learning. I've learned from the fellow panelists. I'm actually reading the chat. There's some really interesting experiences, and I think, to me, dialogue, discussion, sharing of our hopes, but also our fears about, because I think that we are part of it, and actually being authentic and being vulnerable as a leader, and actually having those conversations that you don't have the answers to this, I think is really helpful. And I agree with Asha that this is what will determine, understanding this and finding a way of making it aligned, which was Asha's point, is a way that organizations can be sustainable, and that people do choose to work for you, and then you do achieve your objectives for the individual, for society, and so on. But that's tough, and you have to keep learning.
Absolutely. And my own final thoughts, considering how do we bring this to a close, I think we could continue this conversation for a few more days, right? It's a complicated subject, an interesting one. I hope everybody listening has learned something. And I'm going to end it where I started. And the first question I asked was, what is culture? And my thoughts about culture is it's not a thing. It's not a reality. It's just us. It's just people together, working together, being effective together. And I think sometimes we put too much noise around it, making it more complicated than it actually is. But the other side of it, as individuals, we are complicated. We manifest ourselves in different ways, in different environments. And at work, it is creating that respect and understanding of each other that enables us to be highly effective. So that's my personal conclusion to what culture actually is. And I'd like to say to everybody, particularly our panelists, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate this. And all our participants, from everybody putting in so many comments on the webinar, and for the participation in the polls. Thank you, everybody, and I hope you have a great day.